The CNBC app. Global market news in one place. Customizable sections and personalized alerts. Stocks tracking, interactive charts and market insights all in your hands. Stay connected. Stay informed. Download the CNBC app today.
Welcome to Squawk Box Europe. I'm Karen Show with Ben Boulos in London. Dan Murphy is in Dubai and Ritika Gupta is in France for a crucial G7 meeting. These are your headlines.
First today, Iran says it's reviewing a US ceasefire proposal but firmly denies President Trump's claims that talks are underway, with Tehran desperate to strike a deal.
And they are negotiating, by the way, and they want to make a deal so badly.
No negotiations have happened until now. I say this with certainty that we've had no conversations and negotiations.
Stocks fall and oil rises as investors reassess the chances of a ceasefire. Former Goldman Sachs CEO Lloyd Blankfein telling CNBC investors should tread carefully.
This would not be the time to have your maximum risk that you would ever take and be very fleet of foot and very protective of your position. I think people should be good contingency planners at this time.
G7 foreign ministers arrive for a key summit in France as the Middle East and Ukraine dominate the agenda.
NATO's Supreme Allied Commander for Transformation tells CNBC the military alliance is confronting new forms of warfare in the Middle East and Ukraine and urges Europe to take on a greater leadership role.
So during 30 years, and especially on the turn of the century, most of European countries have been free riders from their own security. They downloaded or outsourced their defense.
Well, there's no doubt that investors were trading the headlines yesterday, but the big question is how believable are the headlines given the mixed messaging we're getting. So the risk on yesterday translating to risk off today. The latest is that Iran has no intention of holding talks with the US, according to the country's foreign minister, dismissing suggestions that any communication via mediators amounted to negotiations. Abbas Araghchi has told state media that a US ceasefire proposal is under review, but reiterated that Iran wants to end the war on its own terms. Iranian state media earlier reported that Iran will reject the US proposal and has issued its own terms for ending the conflict. According to state broadcaster Press TV, the list includes a complete halt to aggression and recognition of Iran's sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz. Meanwhile, Washington and Tehran have continued to offer conflicting messaging on the status of negotiations.
We're winning so big, nobody's ever seen anything like we're doing in the Middle East with Iran. And they are negotiating, by the way, and they want to make a deal so badly, but they're afraid to say it because they figure they'll be killed by their own people. They're also afraid they'll be killed by us. There's never been a head of a country that wanted that job less.
No negotiations have happened until now. I say this with certainty that we've had no conversations and negotiations with our American counterparts. But over the past few days, our American counterparts have begun sending messages through other countries that are our friends. If there are messages through others to which we respond with our own position and demands, that is not called conversation, nor negotiation, or anything. This is simply sending messages through others.
Let's get out to Dan to help us read between the lines here. Dan, the messaging from President Trump is that Iran is desperate to do a deal. It doesn't sound like they are that desperate when you hear some of the lines that have been communicated to the West.
That's exactly right, Karen. And we have Brent crude holding at around $100 a barrel this morning as traders really weigh the gap between what Washington is offering and what Tehran is demanding. It suggests that Trump's end-of-week deadline is going to be very hard to meet. Iran, of course, as you've reported, formally rejecting the US ceasefire proposal, calling Washington's push for indirect talks illogical and not viable. Iran's foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, also saying there are no negotiations, only messages passing through intermediaries. So what Trump is calling talks Tehran is calling message delivery. And to make the situation even more complex this morning, Iran has its own demands as well. It wants guarantees that the US and Israel won't resume attacks, reparations for war damages, and recognition of its own authority over the Strait of Hormuz as well. The US plan, meanwhile, calls on Iran to dismantle its nuclear facilities and missile arsenal in exchange for sanctions relief. One US official calling Iran's demands, quote, ridiculous and unrealistic. And what's also new this morning is the fact that the voice of the Gulf is also growing louder in response as well. The UAE ambassador to the US, Yusuf Al-Otaiba, publishing an opinion piece in the Wall Street Journal this morning calling for a conclusive outcome, not a simple ceasefire. Also warning that building a fence around the problem would simply defer the next crisis. And this is interesting because it symbolizes what is a hardening of the UAE stance here, really a reflection of just how frustrated the Gulf capitals are at not just the duration of the conflict, but also the lack of a military or diplomatic off-ramp. Meanwhile, the CEO of Abu Dhabi's national oil company, Dr. Sultan Al Jaber, also meeting with Vice President J.D. Vance at the White House overnight and reiterating that energy security equals global security, and once again urging free passage through the Strait of Hormuz. You'll recall that earlier at CERAWeek in Houston, Al Jaber called Iran's blockade in the Strait of Hormuz economic terrorism. So it's interesting to see the voice of the Gulf growing louder here as it appears that the White House continues to face an impossible option here. That is either a climb down from its current position, given the fact that the Iranians are clearly not playing ball, or what could be the next phase here, which may be a ground operation inside Iran or Karg Island as the US continues to deploy more military assets and more troops to the region, set to arrive by the end of this week.
Dan, I want to pick up on that point because it feels like we have this very long proposal and we could debate what could be in, what could be out in terms of negotiation. But it feels like Trump is also moving personnel around on the chessboard, and that could have a dramatic impact on negotiations.
Exactly, Karen. And while it appears that there's no off-ramp at the moment on the US side, clearly some of these Iranian demands are also non-starters, not just for the Americans, but also for US allies here in the Gulf, including the UAE and Saudi Arabia. Iran's demands that it can charge a toll on ships passing through the Strait of Hormuz has clearly angered and worried leaders here in the Gulf. They see that as clearly a compromise, maybe even a build-out on Iran's current position. And at the same time as well, the US obviously not willing to allow that to happen either. So exactly where this goes next remains to be seen. And as we've been saying for the last couple of days as well, exactly who President Trump is really negotiating with inside Iran is a big question mark at this point as well. Of course, it has been suggested that it's Iran's parliamentary speaker, maybe even the replacement for Ali Larijani, who was taken out in an airstrike last week. But in order to have real clarity and transparency on these negotiations, if you can even call them that, then we really need to know who the US is actually speaking with. And right now, we can't see that. Back over to you.
Dan, thank you very much for bringing us the latest there. In the meantime, let's pivot to markets where we're seeing the oil price again much higher. Ben.
Yes, this is a bit of an about turn from the previous session. Both light crude and Brent crude up just under 3% there. Light crude up 2.7, well, about the same amount. And Brent over $100, sitting there at $105 a barrel. That's after Iran sort of rebutted those claims coming from Washington that talks were ongoing. So investors clearly still nervous that the disruption to the supply doesn't look like it could end anytime soon. And we've seen that gold has been moving inversely to oil because we've seen traders very concerned about the inflationary impacts of the higher oil price. When oil tends to go higher, we're seeing investors pricing in interest rate hikes in some cases. So obviously that makes holding the currency more attractive than the non-yielding precious metal. Gold actually, despite being a traditional safe haven, down 13% since the beginning of the Iran war. Let's see the effect all of this is having on the Asian markets. And as you can probably guess, when the oil price goes up, the equity markets tend to go down, and we're seeing the Kospi, which has been the most volatile of the benchmarks in Asia, leading the losses in the current session, down more than 3.2%. The Nikkei and the Hang Seng, the Shanghai, all the main benchmarks trading into the red this Thursday. Clearly some skepticism there around Donald Trump's claims and the US administration's claims that talks with Iran are ongoing. Let's have a look at how all this is playing out in terms of the anticipated open here in Europe. And there we are, a softer start to the trading session being called across the main regional benchmarks. And after a positive trading session on Wall Street, let's see across the Atlantic how things are looking. A bit of reversal in fortunes there. A negative open being called across the three main Wall Street markets. Interestingly, though, if you look at the week to date, those three major averages are up this week after the meltdown that we saw in the previous week. Karen.
Let's see whether it holds into the Friday session, Ben. All foreign ministers from G7 countries will meet in France from today amid wars in Iran and Ukraine, with concerns over the economic impact of both and the potential impact of an increasingly fit for US foreign policy bubbling away in the background. European leaders have already been weighing in ahead of today's meeting. Let's take a listen.
Obviously, we have also talked about the many international dossiers that are on the table, starting obviously with the crisis in the Middle East, a crisis that involves everyone and that, if it were to continue over time, could clearly cause economic and social consequences that would end up affecting more nations, the most vulnerable nations, starting with the African continent.
Depuis quelques jours, on fait face clairement à un conflit qui a changé de nature.
For the past few days, we've clearly been facing a conflict that has changed in nature, and therefore the economic consequences have also changed. Today, 30 to 40% of the refining capacity in the Gulf is damaged or destroyed. I spoke to the Qatari Minister of Energy. 17% of gas production capacity is destroyed today following the attacks on these facilities, which will take years. We're talking about 3 years to restore.
On parle de 3 ans.
To make it crystal clear, this war is a catastrophe for the world's economies. The impact is absolutely evident. This is a real impact, and at the same time, the European partners and Germany as well highlighted from the beginning on. We have not been consulted before. Nobody asked us before. It's not our war.
That commentary from Germany really setting the scene. Ritika with more from France around this G7 meeting today. Ritika, I was reading a line from Le Monde and saying, look, the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio will travel to France to sell the Iran war to skeptical G7 allies. Is that what we're going to hear, that the Americans are going to try and change the hearts and minds of Europeans and others at the table because they've been pointing out the legalities here, the breach of international law, but also the energy crisis that has been sparked on the back of it?
Absolutely, Karen. That's going to be key to these discussions, the pressure that the allies are going to face from Washington. But Karen, I'm here in Rambouillet. This is just an hour outside of Paris in the French countryside. This is where G7 foreign ministers are going to be meeting. It actually goes back to the origins of the first summit, which was in 1975. Now, they originally thought they would be talking about the Ukraine war, but now events dominating by the Middle East, that is dominating the agenda here. Now, the immediate concern is the Strait of Hormuz. This is the critical oil supply route that has been disrupted and is rattling the markets and investors. Now, the G7 has tried to show unity on this. They've condemned Iran for the attacks on energy infrastructure as well as pledging to step in to support energy supplies if needed. But the real focus, as you mentioned there, is going to be the pressure coming from Washington to do more. And we did just get a headline also that the French finance minister is going to be calling for a special G7 meeting on Monday to address this with finance ministers, central bank governors and energy ministers. But the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio, he's going to be arriving tomorrow, and this is going to be his first international trip since the war in the Middle East began. And as you mentioned, he's expected to try to win over skeptical G7 allies to a tougher US approach on Iran, because so far most of the members, they haven't wanted to support this US military style intervention, and they don't want to be drawn in directly. This has evoked the ire of President Donald Trump, who of course has also delivered delivered a 15-point peace plan which goes well beyond a ceasefire. It demands that Iran gets rid of its nuclear and ballistic missiles program as well as reopens the strait. But Iran is rejecting that, and G7 isn't so fully on board either. Whilst they agree around the problems with Iran and the risk, they can't agree on a solution. They are prioritizing diplomacy and de-escalation over direct military intervention. But Karen, as we're seeing all of the markets in disarray, they're fast moving, the oil markets in focus, those divisions are now becoming harder and harder to ignore.
OK, Ritika, thank you very much. We'll speak again a little later. Now, most European countries have been free riders from their own security for the last 30 years. That's according to NATO Supreme Allied Commander Transformation Admiral Pierre Vandier, who spoke to Charlotte, and they discussed the obstacles facing the West today.
So, in fact, what we see in Ukraine, and I will not comment the way they fight, because you have a lot of debate on would we fight as they do today, given the fact that we have, for example, some stuff which is not what they have. But anyway, what we see in my transformation point of view, it's a question of DNA of adaptation. In fact, whatever your tactic is today, we have a tougher enemy, which is adapting itself at very high speed and which is finding cracks in our way to fight. So we need to be very flexible, very adaptable. And the challenge for the West today is to have an industry which is able to adapt at the speed of the threat. And this is it's an endeavor which is today largely complex.
And on that point, you say this industry has to adapt to these new threats, and yet we come of decades of globalization and a lot of our industry moving to other parts of the world. So I guess different countries have to rebuild the industry to different extents. I get France always had a strong defense industry, but how then is the European defense industry responding, despite the money that we hear from policymakers saying they're pouring into defense? How is the European defense industry really rebuilding itself now?
So the first intent has been to lift up the constraints on the production, to have some orders that will help the existing industry to build more. The question we have today that some of the features on the stuff we are building today in the West, including the US, are difficult to mass produce. And so we need to invent the weapons that are able to be mass produced by our systems. So today, for example, you have linkage between the car industry and the military industry. Part of the drone pieces on the missiles can be built and produced by the existing industry, which is not specifically military one. And we see on the red side that they already weaponize a large part of their industry. So today the challenge is to design weapons that are adaptable, that are interoperable, so no vendor lock, open architectures, and then you can take benefit of all the rest of the industry to accelerate your production.
It's Admiral Pierre Vandier there speaking to Charlotte. Now, coming up on the show, Lloyd Blankfein tells CNBC the damage from the Iran war is going to last even if there were to be a resolution tomorrow. We'll bring you more from Steve's conversation with the former Goldman CEO. Plus, a Los Angeles jury finds Meta and YouTube negligent in a social media addiction trial. And we'll discuss the impact of the Iran war on global fertilizer supply with Yara CEO Svein Tore Holsether. Don't miss that conversation. It's coming up next.
I'm Steve Sedgwick from CNBC, and in my new podcast, Executive Decisions, I ask powerful leaders about their decisions that changed everything.
I'm not frightened of making tough decisions, and I think leadership can be very lonely.
Business leaders should not stay quiet in a world which is super complex.
It is absolutely fine to also change your mind.
Tough calls, personal crossroads. These are the stories that we can all learn from. It's Executive Decisions from CNBC. Get it wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back. The Strait of Hormuz is responsible for around a third of global seaborne fertilizer trade, according to the United Nations. As disruption in the area continues, the price of fertilizer is rising, causing concern for countries and farmers in the Northern Hemisphere as they prepare for the crucial spring months. Joining us now, Sven Tore Holseter, who is the CEO of Yara. It's very good to have you with us. Just give us a sense of the impact that you're seeing on fertilizer from the disruption to passage through the Strait of Hormuz at the moment.
Well, it's a very serious situation in the Middle East right now with significant humanitarian consequences. And it's going straight into the food system as well, because fertilizer is not just another commodity. Half of the world's food production is a direct result of fertilizer being applied in the fields of the farmers. And this part of the world and the Strait of Hormuz is the most important shipping channel for urea fertilizer. And now with this being blocked, that is going straight into the availability and also the pricing of fertilizer globally.
And how much of an impact do you think this will have compared, for example, with the spike in food prices we saw after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine? Because, of course, Ukraine, a big exporter of grain, and not so much the case in this situation.
That's correct. And there are some differences compared to where we were at in 2022, right after Russia's war on Ukraine, because Ukraine is a major food producer. 400 million people are food dependent on Ukraine. And then you had an immediate impact on food prices as well. Right now, the impact on crop prices is actually quite small, but the impact on fertilizer and other input factors are much more significant. And that's putting a lot of pressure on farmers, and it comes at possibly some of the worst timing for the farmers in Europe and other parts of the world, because we are in application season right now. And farmers were not very profitable before this, and this puts an additional burden on farmers that could have long-term impact and also medium-term. If fertilizer is not going to the field of the farmers now, that would impact this year's harvest.
Just talk to us about that timeline a little bit more, because we're hearing from the oil perspective that the tankers that have been loaded up pre-conflict had been arriving in Europe. But when it comes to the fertilizer, how much was in stockpile, and what is that going to mean in terms of further yields down the track?
Yeah, and this is the issue, right? Because these are large industrial complexes producing fertilizer, and they need to run 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. And it's connected to the global supply chains. And again, we see how fragile the supply chains are for food across the world. And at a certain point, you're filling your inventory, you're not able to ship the product out, and then you need to shut down your plant. And that is what is happening right now. So it's not just product not making its way through the Strait of Hormuz, it's actually product not being produced in the region. And it's also spilling into other parts of the world where there's now a lack of gas availability, as we've seen now in India. We're seeing it in parts of Pakistan as well, Bangladesh, that there's simply not gas available to keep production at the level that it was before the attack on Iran.
When it comes to Europe, there have been questions raised about de-risking again from international fertilizer supply chains. Why is there not more produced locally? Why don't we have better sourcing domestically? Is that a feature now as we again face another fragility in the food system on the back of yet another conflict?
Well, I certainly hope so. It's yet another signal to Europe on the importance of strategic autonomy. We saw that during the energy crisis, starting already in the summer of 2021, amplified in 2022 with Russia's attack on Ukraine. We have an energy issue in Europe, and we continue to have that. And now yet another supply chain is impacted as well with fertilizer. It just emphasizes we need to strengthen the framework around the European farmers and also the industry that supplies them, like the fertilizer industry.
Sven, it also raises the question around green policies in Europe, because even before this conflict, there's a pushback from a lot of countries about the carbon adjustment tax, the extra green tax lobbed on fertilizer coming into the bloc. Now, of course, with escalating nitrogen fertilizer prices, it raises the point again. Are these policies useful when you're talking about key supplies that are so important for food systems?
Yes, they are useful, and we need to do two things at the same time right now. We need to ensure strategic autonomy, but we also have the climate challenge, and we need to reduce emissions. And these measures are put in place to create a level playing field. And I mean, look at extreme weather, and for farmers, and we work with them across the world, it's one of the occupations hardest hit by climate change, whether it's floods and droughts or heat or cold spells. It's going straight into the farmers' livelihoods. So we need to do both at the same time. But then it's also important that we create a level playing field, that we strengthen the business in Europe as well. But here is also key that we need to have high carbon price but low carbon cost for European industry to support the transition, and also that the member states actually support the businesses in this transition as we try to reduce the emissions as well.
Svein, I was reading about this and the impact it is having on farmers. And as I understand it, a lot of farms will have stocked up on fertilizer, so the effect on the price spike won't be immediate. But they also make the point that they are price takers rather than price setters, depending on who they sell their produce to. In terms of the time lag then, before we start to see an impact, I mean, let's say the conflict were resolved this week or next week, presumably we would still see an impact on fertilizer and then the crop that it would have been used for in what, 6 months from now, a year from now? How soon before we see the actual real world effect of it?
You're absolutely right. A lot of farmers had stocked up on fertilizer and had it in inventory ahead of the season before the war broke out. But now you're in a part of the season where you also replenish the stocks if you're a farmer, and that's where a lot of these issues come to the surface. How do you justify buying and applying fertilizer compared to the crop prices right now? And even if this was resolved tomorrow, it still has a lasting impact because production is lost. And if I try to estimate what is happening across the world now, it could be up to 1 million tons of urea fertilizer now not being produced on a weekly basis. And let me try to translate that into what does that mean in terms of food supply. So that's enough fertilizer and enough nutrition to create about 20 billion meals per week that are now lost as a result of this. So fertilizer is a very powerful product, and for some crops, if you don't apply it, you could see as much as a 50% decrease already in the first harvest. So that says something about the timelines here.
Svein, if you think about the policy response we could see from here, given the food crisis that we're talking about, does it feel like we're going back to the COVID days where there could be some export restrictions on some key grains, whether there could be further repricing that causes a food crisis in poorer nations? How are you thinking about how this story plays out?
On fertilizer is already happening, and we just saw earlier this week that Russia put in place export restrictions on nitrates fertilizer. Now, on the food prices, they haven't reacted in the same way yet, but that's all the more reason to turn on the alarm right now and warn about the potential consequences now of not using the right amount of fertilizer that you agronomically should use, and how that could impact crops in the future in order to avoid these future price shocks and then be back where we were at in COVID, but also after Russia's attack on Ukraine, that you see export restrictions also on food.
Svein, thank you so much for joining us. We do appreciate your expertise in the industry. Svein Tore Holstetter with us, the CEO of Yara. And for more on the situation around fertilizers, you can read Sam's article on CNBC.com. A look at futures and how we're shaping up for the trading session. I was pointing out earlier that the market has turned more cautious today as they step away from just the headlines and digest the detail that the conflict still doesn't look like it's nearing an end at this point. We've got 8 tenths off the Stocks 50 futures. FTSE's called weaker, 9 tenths down on the DAX. So reversal from the springboard action we saw yesterday. The markets leapt into firmer territory. For instance, we're up 1.4 on the DAX as we closed out that session. So we're looking to give back some territory.